Brandon is a BKC affiliate and currently a Knight Policy Fellow at George Washington's Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. He speaks frequently about the role that transparency can play in helping build a better internet, as well as helping educate lawmakers and regulators on how to require more data access in ethical and privacy-protecting ways. Previously, Brandon was the CEO and co-founder of CrowdTangle, a social analytics tool that was acquired by Facebook in 2016 and was one of the main ways that Facebook was transparent with the outside world. Through his work with CrowdTangle, Brandon and his team worked with thousands of news outlets, human rights groups, election protection organizations, fact checkers, and more to help monitor and study social media. So with that, I will turn it over to Brandon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Super honored to be here and talk today. So I'm going to be talking about the future of social media transparency, and we're going to cover 4 basic topic areas. First, a little bit just on why transparency matters at all. Secondly, where are we now, and a tiny bit of how did we get here. But then I want to move into the part about where we're going in the future. And I'm going to divide it into 2 sections. One is a long-term vision of what are the underlying pieces of infrastructure we need to get the kind of transparency we want in the long term. And then secondly, also, I'd like to try and make an argument for a potential short-term opportunity as well. And then after that, this will hopefully also leave about 15-20 minutes for Q&A at the end as well. So let's just jump right into why transparency matters. And I'm going to start by just sharing a very short kind of example that stood out to me this year on why this work matters. And the truth is there's a lot of examples, and I'll reference that a little bit later. But there's a particular moment that stood out to me, and it had to do with Facebook and its fact-checking program. As a quick background, in 2016, Facebook launched their fact-checking program. It was designed to be kind of a large-scale intervention in reducing the spread of misinformation across their entire platform. And within about 7 years of being launched, they had over 100+ global partners. They were funding over 90 of those partners, operating in 60 different languages. And while the program certainly had its limitations, the program used labels to add context to well over 100 million posts, probably significantly more, including at one point 68 million posts directly related to the European election, according to Facebook's own data. But earlier this year, Facebook announced they'd be shutting down the program. If you saw the official announcement, this was the all of the information they provided about that decision. They said fact checkers have just been too politically biased and destroyed more trust than they've created. And we're going to phase in a more comprehensive community notes system. So what stood out to me about this announcement, among other things, is that what you have here is 3 empirical claims that they've been too biased, that they have destroyed more trust than they've created, and that a community notes system is more comprehensive. And yet, in the announcement, there's absolutely zero attempt to provide any data behind any of those 3 claims from their own analysis of the programs, let alone a world in which there was actually independent analysis of those programs and those claims. And so what you have essentially is one of the largest interventions in political and civic content that was ever run by any platform that was ended, and there was zero attempt to make any sort of empirical or data-driven argument to the public about why that was the case. And for me, it was kind of perfectly emblematic of the situation which we're in, which is these platforms are incredibly important. And in fact, they're only getting more important. And yet, when it comes to how they operate, not only are there very limited ways in which the broader world can kind of democratically participate in that governance, but they're frequently making decisions without even sharing even hints of data about what is driving those and to the extent to which they're justified or match their external explanations, et cetera. So I want to zoom in a little bit more on also just the state of the world when it comes to news and our information ecosystems. Um, a lot of this is not going to be new to folks on this call, but or on the Zoom, but traditional news mediums continue to be in a multi-decade state of rapid decline. Um, Here in the US, daily newspapers we have lost over a third of print newspapers in the US since 2005. If you look at things like magazines, subscriptions to magazines have been cut in half over the last 20 years and are only continuing to drop. Um, and at this point in the US, adults spend more time watching digital video than they do TV. And meanwhile, and that is partly because the other side of this coin is that social media platforms continue to surge in their engagement and usage. Most recently, that is partly due to the explosion of short form video. But while traditional news mediums are declining, social media is exploding. And that is both in the US, but also globally. And if you look at short form video in particular, that graph on the bottom right, there are places in uh, all over the world, including in Africa and Southeast Asia and elsewhere, where um, people are getting news in the form of short form video. Uh, um, Over 90 or 80 to 90% of populations are getting short form news content on a weekly basis. But what is happening on these platforms? Who are the largest accounts? What are the dominant narratives? What stories are trending? How are elected officials using these mediums? What impact are they having on our kids, our democracies, ourselves, on civic discourse? The truth is, we don't have the data we need to answer all those questions, or even a tiny fraction of those questions. Um, and so a big part of what I've spent the last 10 years focused on is how do we make more progress in having platforms responsibly be able to share data. Now, one of the challenges is that requiring data sharing 100% and absolutely comes with real risks. And that includes everything from malicious use by bad actors, misinforming the public about important topics, opportunity costs for other reforms or other asks we might be making of platforms, incentivizing data collection itself, enabling surveillance, commercial or governmental, and more. But it also delivers real world benefits. And I'd like to argue that there's five major areas of real world impact if you can get these sort of data sharing programs to work and to work effectively. One is they can actually influence the platforms themselves. And that includes everything from identifying content enforcement gaps to improving their own policies to helping bring local nuance and context to how they're operating in different countries and communities around the world. Second is shaping public opinion about the platforms and to what degree even external actors are using the platforms. So it's about accountability for how the platforms are run, but also accountability for how others are using the platforms. Given the amount of data and the amount of engagement and the diversity of topics that are covered on a lot of these platforms, a better understanding of that also simply contributes to our academic understanding of a lot of like complicated and very important issues. Data sharing can also influence regulatory approaches. And then lastly, and to some degree, I think the one I have been the most compelled by in some ways is also simply helping contribute to an open marketplace of ideas. And that if these platforms are becoming the dominant forms of social and political and civic communication, to some degree, being able to simply see what's happening on them becomes a kind of baseline ability of having open liberal democracies with free marketplaces of ideas. So, in fact, I also, in a somewhat shameless plug, also, if you want to go even more in depth on this, Naomi Schiffman and myself put out a paper this month that you can get at the website of the George Washington Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, where we specifically look at all five of those areas and 23 different real-world examples where sharing data from platforms led to specific concrete impact in each of those five areas. And so if you want to go deeper, that report is a great resource. So where are we right now when it comes to this issue? I've generally kind of want to make the case that there's four different eras of data sharing. The first I call the open era. This is as most of these platforms were getting off of the ground, and at kind of roughly 2006 to 2016. And more than anything, I think this was defined by the use of the widespread use of the Twitter API. It was incredibly available. It was text-based. It made it easily, super easy to monitor and study. There were also a decent amount of fairly open Facebook APIs as well, especially their Open Graph One, designed to kind of facilitate a developer platform, but could also be used for research and studying, and also a decent amount of scraping on top of everything. But that era ended when we have what Axel Bruns labeled the AP Calypse, when following Cambridge Analytica, there was a massive shutdown of not all of, but the vast majority of Facebook's APIs, and even a bunch of other platforms that took a more kind of curtailed approach on what they were sharing. But that API shutdown also transitioned into what became more dedicated researcher programs that had more sophisticated vetting, but also a lot more kind of corporate control over what the programs looked like, who got access, what data was being shared, et cetera. But that is also where you get things like where CrowdTangle was a part of, but Social Science One, the Twitter Research Consortium, and more. That era ended, however, in around 2021, and what I call the data lockdown. And this was in large part precipitated by Elon purchasing Twitter and relatively shortly thereafter shutting down most of their researcher sharing programs. And that was followed by a lot of other industry behaviors that kind of mirrored the same decisions. Reddit moved to a paid model on their data. CrowdTangle was kind of shut down in a similar period, et cetera. And in general, across the board, it got much, much harder for the research community to get any data from social media platforms. We're now in the fourth, which is kind of what I'm also calling the regulated era, which is we are beginning to see the emergence of regulatory requirements around some data sharing. However, we're in the very nascent phases. And the most significant development we've had so far in this period is the Digital Services Act in Europe, and in particular, Article 40, which has two different requirements around data sharing. One is around sensitive data that is still in the process of being designed. But then the second was an article called Article 40.12, which is already law and requires platforms to provide real-time access to public data. And in fact, what we've seen is since the passage of that particular article, there was a rush over the course of about 6 to 9 months of a lot of what were called the qualifying very large online platforms to release programs designed to come into compliance with 40.12. And for those of us who pay attention to the space, it was actually a very exciting time. There were platforms that had never released researcher programs, including things like Alibaba and others that were suddenly launching programs designed to be in compliance with this article. However, the truth is that now that the research community has had almost a year to try and use these programs, they still have a lot of work to do. And there are organizations in Europe that follow this very closely. I encourage you to check them out, including the DSA Observatory, the DSA Collaborative, and others. But the truth is, what we're seeing is a handful of things. One is a lot of these programs don't actually have all the data they should. A lot of these programs are put behind so many restrictions that it's very hard for the research community to actually get access. Or in some cases, it almost feels as if some of these programs are not designed to meet all of the needs, or at least the core needs of the research community, particularly effectively. And in fact, they've been so lacking that the European Commission has announced at least several different investigations into whether any of these programs should even be considered compliance. So it is progress, but what has become clear is that that timeline is going to be a little longer than I think even the most optimistic of us hoped. So where does that leave us now, and what does the future hold? So I want to start first with a long-term vision. I think I would like to argue that the primary lesson over the last 10 years and the last three eras of transparency is that we need a solution that is entirely independent of industry, in the sense of we can't rely on voluntary efforts anymore. There's just too many examples of them, either in good faith or bad faith, but even in totally good faith, of the platforms stepping away from voluntary commitments they've made. And so we need to find a way to get to something that is more sustainable but doesn't depend on voluntary programs. And so that's why what I would say is there are four pillars to getting to a long-term vision we need. And the first is we need legal requirements and or legal protections that allow researchers to get access to the data they need without relying on voluntary programs. But on top of that, there's three other core components. The second is we need ethics and privacy guidance. There are a lot of genuinely thorny issues around privacy, potential harms to users, issues around consent. I'll go through this in more detail. But there are a lot of thorny issues that get connected to this data that we both, one, don't want platforms deciding the answers to, and in a lot of cases, we don't want governments deciding either. And so we need civil society, academics, ethicists, et cetera, helping figure out what are responsible ways to use and access this data and manage it. Second is this is an enormous amount of data, and there's a real risk of it being available but totally unusable. And uh, there's a book I really has influenced me a lot called Full Disclosure: The Perils and Promise of Transparency. And one of the core arguments in that book is that meaningful transparency also means having data that is usable. And part of what that means is we need to create tooling and infrastructure that turns very large data sets into usable data sets. And then lastly, we need funding available for the research community to also do anything with this work. So where are we on all four of these pillars at the moment? When it comes to legal requirements and protections, we are beginning to make progress. The most significant development by far is the Digital Services Act, which I talked about. There are also have been slow but steady progress on more legal protections, including in the US and Germany, in part due to lawsuits from Elon and Twitter, which I will talk about a little bit later. We're also making some progress on simply designing model legislation at all. When I began getting involved in this work in 2021, 2022, the truth is there wasn't a lot of written legislation about how to actually answer a lot of these thorny questions that regulators need in order to pass thoughtful bills. And we're beginning to make a lot of progress on what that sort of model legislation looks like. On the three other areas, we're also making some progress and in some cases experiencing some steps backwards. But when it comes to ethics and privacy guidance, there's work being done to stand up what's being called kind of an intermediary body that supports the Digital Services Act, that sits in between local member state digital service coordinators and the platforms to help them all in a more coordinated and thoughtful way answer some of those thorny ethics questions. That also is related to a set of recommendations around exactly how to do that in detail that came out of the European Digital Media Observatory, and then was also opened up for commenting through the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the previous White House. And there's also a working group happening from the Georgetown Knight Institute on trying to come up with a meaningful definition of public data that could be used for some data sharing efforts. So there's work being done on making progress on this. Again, a lot of work to do, but it's meaningful. On the shared tooling and infrastructure, we're seeing a lot of investments in different types of kind of the technical stack required on this, including everything from the University of Michigan's SOMAR to a new effort out of Princeton called the Princeton Accelerator, Junkipedia, a dashboard and data collection tool from the National Conference on Citizenship, and a handful of others. And then lastly, there is a history of funding in this space that has supported a decent amount of work, whether it's through government funding, foundations, or industry. This is probably the area where, at least here in the US, we have made progress, but is under enormous amount of threat here in the US, largely due to cuts to the NSF and State Department, and is probably the one that's by far the most at risk and in the worst shape. Um, but one thing that's clear across all four of those pillars is they're going to take time. And so one of the questions I've spent a lot of time thinking about is what can we do in the short term? And so that's what I want to focus on for the final section here. What I want to make the case for and the argument for is that there is an opportunity to do way more responsible public interest scraping. And as a quick attempt at definition, scraping is essentially the automated collection of publicly available data. And the truth is that scraping has been a cornerstone of internet research for decades. But when it comes to scraping social media, while it is absolutely one of the tools the research community has used, it's also had real obstacles to getting widespread adoption. And I'm just going to go through a few of those because they're real and not insignificant and not, and numerous. But they basically fall into three categories. One is there are technical challenges to automated collection of data from these platforms. All these platforms are different. They have slightly different schema. They're changing regularly. There are often rate limits, and in some cases, it's easy for platforms to adversarially block scraping attempts. There's the whole question of simply data volume, usability, data integrity. A scraper can very easily go down for an hour, a day, a week, and what does that do to your integrity of the data, and more. There's ethical issues around everything from privacy to whether users or entities have consented to their data even being collected. There's no industry-wide definition of what public data is if you want to attempt to set that bar for yourself. There are free speech concerns, jawboning potential, and more. And then legal issues. There's also no shortage of legal challenges. There are terms of service issues, copyright and IP. Everything gets way more complicated if you're trying to do this internationally and doing this across jurisdictions, including around data transfer of the actual data itself, and more. So there are a lot of nuances to doing this. And yet, there is widespread commercial scraping of social media platforms. You can go to a company right now called Bright Data, and if you want, you can purchase scraped data from Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and more. On top of that, as a quick spoiler alert, another white paper I'm working on, and it's going to be published relatively soon, is one in which we looked at some of the largest commercial social media listening tools and tried to get a better sense of where they get their data from. And one of the most common responses was essentially alluding to the fact that they all use purchased scraped data. So here are at least three quotes that we got from large commercial entities on where they get their data. And it makes it fairly abundantly clear that they're buying this data from commercial scrapers. So this is happening a lot in the commercial sphere. The truth is also that the world is changing. And that has a lot of implications for how possible and feasible public interest scraping can be. The first is that the platforms themselves are changing. And one of the biggest changes is they're in some ways simply becoming less social. In the current trial happening between FTC and Meta, one of the cases the FTC is trying to make is that Facebook has a monopoly in private social networking. And one of the arguments Meta is attempting to make against the FTC is that they are, in fact, no longer a private social networking company. And according to Mark, in his testimony, he said Facebook is now more of a broad discovery and entertainment space. And the data behind it is they presented only 17% of Facebook views and 7% of Instagram views come from friends' posts. All the rest come from what is called unconnected content, which is essentially publicly available content that's being shown to users based on their interests or their followers, but not because they have a close social private connection with the user. On top of that, there are an increasing number of rulings coming from courts, both in the US and around the world, that are enhancing legal protections for public interest scraping. Now, there have been some that have ruled against it, but some of the more recent ones are several lawsuits brought by Twitter against scrapers, including the Center for Countering Digital Hate, but also others, in which once they went to court, the rulings came down in favor of public interest scraping. Now, those are far from over, but the trend has generally been in the direction of creating more legal protections for this sort of thing. On the regulatory side, Article 40.12 in the Digital Services Act, what it actually says is providers of very large online platforms shall give access without undue delay to data, including where technically possible, to real-time data. And among uh, kind of advocates and researchers and others in Europe, there have been kind of two interpretations of what that actual line means. One is that platforms have to provide bespoke programs that make this data available through APIs or inside dashboards or cloud services, et cetera. The second, and this is something that Patty Learson has argued, is that you could also interpret this as a negative responsibility to not block public interest scraping. And in fact, there was a court ruling just this week on Monday where two civil society groups in Germany sued Twitter over trying to get access to public data prior to the election and citing Article 40.12. And this morning, one of the things that that court ruled is that they have jurisdiction to decide these things going forward. Now, that's a very nuanced kind of ruling, but the short version is it is a positive. It is the research community is interpreting it as a very positive development in trying to continue to enhance legal protections around this, in large part because of 40.12 and the regulatory progress that was made around it. Now, the truth is that scraping is not new in the research community at all. It is happening right now, and it is happening also on social media. The problem is it is largely done under a large cloud of legal uncertainty, funders who don't necessarily want to fund it because of all the challenges, and also a lot of obscured methodologies because of the degree to which there are risks associated with doing it. But on top of that, more recently, because AI companies have now been so voraciously attempting to scrape, including on social media platforms, some of these platforms have also started to become more adversarial to scrapers, including ones that previously didn't do it. And so the last development I think you're seeing is more researchers being more vocal about trying to find ways to enable responsible scraping of these platforms. And in fact, in Tech Policy Press earlier this year, Ryan McGrady, Ethan Zuckerman, and Kevin Zhang made the case for what they called an era of unpermissioned research. And in my head, I see that as almost inserting an era in between the regulated one and the data lockdown, where the only real choice a lot of researchers have is to do unpermissioned research until the regulated versions get better. And in fact, when Europe opened up for commenting and did a call for evidence around the data access provisions in the Digital Services Act, and again, this is Patty Learson, who helped do a summary of over 150 comments made by researchers, academics, civil society groups, and more. When it came to public data, the number one request was for usable dashboards, similar to CrownTangle and other tools. But an even more popular request was creating more protections for scraping. So what you're seeing is increasingly more calls to make this a more usable resource for the research community. So what would it take for that to happen? Below is a list of some of what those things include, and this is not meant to be comprehensive. But first, there have to be more legal protections, including oftentimes just clarity, but in some cases, actual more legal protections around everything from terms of service to copyright issues to more immunity from civil liability. The research community needs help on ensuring that there aren't technical restrictions or adversarial blocking by platforms. We need more funders who are not afraid of this work, including if it gets challenged legally. We also need to establish more ethics and privacy frameworks for how to do this responsibly and in a way that protects privacy, puts potentially affected communities first, and more. And then lastly, we need more shared tooling and infrastructure that can process large amounts of data and turn them into meaningful insights. So, in summary, social media platforms are more important than ever. The era of voluntary transparency efforts is officially over, and the work to establish a long-term set of organizations and infrastructure is underway, but is going to take years to finish. And thanks to changes in platform design, recent court rulings, regulatory approaches, and a need for more research, unpermissioned research, responsible public interest scraping represents a short-term solution that could and should be leveraged more widely. So I will pause there and say thank you. Also happy now to answer some questions. And I will stop sharing. I think that's great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon. We do have a couple questions coming in. Great. Okay. So first from Hyla, at least some of the movement towards paid APIs for social media data was the result of how useful and lucrative social media content is for generative AI models and a desire by platforms to maintain control over their data. How do you see AI and data regulation playing into the overall landscape of transparency regulation for platforms?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I'll also preface this by saying I'm not an AI expert, but I'll give from the point of view of data sharing some of the things I feel like I've seen. One is a lot of platforms, and in particular, I know this has happened with YouTube, have gotten more aggressive at trying to block scraping because they have been trying to block other AI companies who are attempting to train on their data. And what's happened is the research community has gotten caught up in that. And so what used to be um, accessible ways to scrape some of these platforms are now getting blocked in an attempt to stop the AI training scrapers. So I think that's one, is they've made it harder for the research community. Two, I worry a lot about legal and policy solutions that try and solve the question of what can you commercially scrape and not scrape, that does not take into account the research community, and that there is a table and the people sitting around it are trying to solve this from a commercial standpoint. And what's going to happen is public interest scraping is not going to have a voice at that table and will end up suffering as a result. And third, I will say on a slightly optimistic note, and slightly orthogonal to this, is I do think AI has like a phenomenal potential to help with transparency efforts by both, one, kind of more efficiently helping with some of the data collection, the hydration, the data cleaning, et cetera. There's also an enormous amount I think it will unlock in terms of getting insights from some of this. And just to make this super concrete, is I think one of the biggest challenges that the social media research community has right now is the explosion of video across all these platforms. Video is very hard to research for a bunch of reasons. It is computationally expensive. If you're talking about a 3-hour video podcast, it is very different from like analyzing 120 characters on Twitter. But yet, I think AI will help unlock the ability to do some video and multimedia analysis that's like incredibly necessary and important right now. But I think the other issues are the ones I think you're probably referring to, and I think they worry me, but also I think present opportunities as well.
Great, thank you. Saul asks, are you envisioning, say, one giant scraper to scrape them all, or a more distributed approach where each research group or consortium stands up its own scraping effort?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think we want to avoid any sort of. I think what scares me more than anything is any sort of dependencies in this space. So I would be nervous about a single entity managing all of the scraping. On the other hand, I also think that one thing we've seen for the last 10 years is that not every organization that needs this data has the ability to build their own tooling to do the work. And so I hope this isn't a cop out, but I think you need a little bit of both. I think you need um, I would love for there to be a bright data-esque tool, but was dedicated to the public interest and could democratize access and handle the maintenance, the legal issues, all these other things on behalf of groups that otherwise couldn't do it themselves. But also ideally some degree of a diverse ecosystem, so that you had some strategic redundancy in the space as well. So I'm going to cop out and say you need both, but they also both have risks.
Both and got it. Um, thanks. Let's see. Brian asks, well, he says, thank you so much for the work you're doing. This is a very important area and the mountain to climb is huge. Do you see any encouraging paths to the type of regulation you want in the US, i.e. the extension or in place or replacement of 230?
Uh, yeah, I'm not a 230 expert, so I think I'm going to steer away from 230 other than to say, well, I don't even know if I think reforming 230, at least from my standpoint, feels very complicated. But it's not my area of expertise, so I think I'm going to stay away from it. But I will say, I th I'm not particularly optimistic in the short term on any federal progress on data sharing or transparency. And it is a complicated solution to attempt to do at the state level for a bunch of reasons. If you're attempting to make progress on scraping, you immediately run into the fact that CFAA is a federal piece of legislation, et cetera. And then if you're attempting to regulate simply not scraping, but bespoke data programs, you run into some real issues around free speech, and is that considered compelled speech? Uh, so it is, I think, complicated to do at the state level to the point where I'm not sure it's the right use of resources. And I think the real progress is happening in Europe. And I think the goal should be like trying to prove that what they're doing in Europe can work in ways that protect free speech and are not burdens to platforms and deliver real, meaningful public interest value. Um,
Yeah, thank you. Um, Joseph has a comment and a question. Thanks for this talk and your work on these issues over the years. At the risk of asking a question that's too general, I don't think it's too general, Joseph. I think it's a great question. I'm wondering, can you speak more to the scope of issues that transparency of social media would be useful for? I'm asking as while we may not have great data on social media activity right now, as a society, we do have a general sense of some of the biggest issues it poses, yet still continue to use these platforms regardless. I'll plan to take a look at the 23 real world examples report you highlighted in your talk.
Great. Yes, I was gonna start by plugging that. I think it's a great example of, examples from literally there's like one of my favorite in there is around Airbnb. It's not, necessarily what people most usually think of when they think of social media, despite how they describe themselves. But it's a great example of how both like scraping and publicly available data can lead to real world improvements. We obviously saw our decent share at CrowdTangle through things like um, you know, uh, around the like influencing platform decisions. There are oftentimes examples where there are malicious bad actors who are getting away with spreading content that's like obviously violating a platform's rules, but simply the sheer size and scale of the platforms means they don't catch everything. And sometimes external folks can catch it and flag it for the platforms and have it removed or have policies updated, et cetera. And we saw that over and over and over through our work at CrowdTangle. Um, there are also, one example I'll just plug, which I didn't put, is not in the report, and I didn't mention in here. I deleted it like at the very last second. Is actually helping with natural disasters. When a natural disaster takes place, whether it is we experience everything from typhoons to to hurricanes, et cetera. You have disaster response organizations who are suddenly being deployed to the field and they have all these questions around where should they be going, how should they be allocating resources, where is the most damage, who needs the most help, and an enormous amount of that information is being shared on social media. And so there um, were examples after examples where we were working with groups like FEMA or the International Red Cross, et cetera, and the data was incredibly valuable for them getting in on the ground and actually helping save lives. And so, yeah, I'm a firm believer of the impact it has across a bunch of different vectors, and it's part of why I'm so passionate about it.
We have a question from our applied social media advisor, Jonathan Bellick. Have you considered a crowdsourcing approach with large numbers of people each gathering information on what they're seeing, like a SETI at home for social media transparency?
Hmm. Um, I personally haven't. I know there are people who've attempted this and just in some cases like made real progress. The National Internet Observatory being run by David Lazar out of Northeastern um, is involves people donating their data uh, and I know also, I think it actually came out of the Applied Social Media Lab. Louis Barclay, I know, is working on a project designed to try and track the largest TikToks. And the idea is that people can submit large TikToks they see. And so it's a crowdsource effort to try and get some visibility into this. Um, so yeah, I think it's a super interesting path. It's not one I've personally spent a ton of time on, but that's not to say it's not. I'm glad other smart people are. And
Yeah,
maybe I'll start one small addendum to that. The area where I have thought about it the most and am beginning to do some work on it is one part of monitoring social media is also monitoring accounts on social media. And to make it like very concrete, like one challenge right now is there's not a particularly great place where you want to go if you want to look up elected officials and their social media accounts around the world. Um, there's not a particularly great resource for that. In some countries, some of them have them, some are publicly available. There are some research organizations that maintain them in different countries. But if you're trying to do it globally, there's no great repository. And in my head, I imagine things like kind of those sort of lists as something that you could very easily crowdsource in a way that would be really helpful and is something I'm kind of um, looking into at the moment.
yeah, thank you. I'll put a link to Louis Barclay's bio and work in our
Okay.
chat. He's one of our applied social media fellows at Berkman Klein. We have a question from Arnaud. How does this issue tie in with decentralization and interoperability of social media?
Um, yeah, I mean, so I'll get philosophical for a moment. And this may verge from less academic into more personal, but you know, my overall worldview is that I think um, there are too few for-profit corporations that control too large a percentage of civic and political discourse around the world, and that there's been a consolidation of power and a centralization of power that isn't healthy for liberal democracy. And I would argue that I actually think a lot of the people at those platforms would say the same thing. Um, and this question is, how do you disrupt that? And there's everything from antitrust to reviving antitrust to things like to technical solutions like interoperability, et cetera. Um, I see transparency as a mechanism for holding some of these platforms more accountable, but also attempting to try and democratize their governance by giving the outside world a better window into what's happening on them. And that doesn't mean that the outside world suddenly has like an equal, seat at the table, but at least they can help, um, you know, at least try and hold platforms accountable when they say things that aren't true, are not living up to compliance promises they've made, and more. And so for me, I put it in the same bucket as spiritually aligned with decentralization and interoperability, but taking a slightly different tack towards accomplishing it.
Thank you. We have another question from, I'm not sure if it's Zeev or Zev, so apologies, but asks for much research, data are downstream of research questions, i.e., we collect data that for the questions we generate. In this research space, we too often start with data and then ask research questions limited to the data we have access to. How are you thinking about which data you're deciding to collect? How are you planning on engaging the research community in your product/data/tool development?
Mhm. Um, that's a great question. Um, yeah, so I think first and foremost, I think the previous eras were too defined by the platforms themselves deciding what data they were going to share. And that was one of the biggest problems. And one of the biggest opportunities I think we have in both the short term and the long term vision is to give the actual research community, academics, civil society groups, elected officials, much more agency over deciding what that data is, and in part because of your exact point, which is the questions and research is going to be downstream from what's available. Um, I think secondly, my work prior to doing CrowdTangle was as a community organizer, and so I believe deeply in kind of trying to bring as many different stakeholders as possible to the table and trying to um, uh, shape these things collaboratively if and when we can. That being said, there are going to be realities to political economy, to the news cycle at any given moment, et cetera, that I think you have to be as mindful as you can to avoid. But for me, it's about collaborative multi-stakeholder processes that try and set the agenda for both like what products you're building, what data is being collected, and then what the research questions are being derived from there. And also, I would say, by the way, like I think we've successfully done this in lots of other spaces. So I also don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. There are other industries, other fields um, where there have been solutions for this, and so I don't think it's a I think there are plenty of examples we can look to and learn from.
Um, Speaking of community organizing, we have kind of a human organizing, human labor question from Akinori. Um, can data be collaboratively collected via browser extensions? Now that most of the APIs are defunct, as your report, The Case for Transparency, shows in data sources used section, do we have any human labor way to gather social media data and store the data? Those collected data can feed mechanisms such as Pro Social Media, the paper by E. Glenn Weil, Luke Thorburn, et cetera, also Audrey Tang.
Yep. Yeah, that paper's great, by the way, and all the researchers who wrote it are like I'm big fans of, and it influenced a lot of my thinking. Yeah, I think there's absolutely ways you can do that, and there are projects in motion right now that do data donation and through browser extensions, through other sorts of mechanisms, and I think they're super useful. What I personally am most interested in is like much larger scaled data collection. And so, I think there are platforms where you could reasonably try and get everything happening on them, whether it is some of the fringe sites like Truth Social or Rumble, et cetera. And again, you have to be very super thoughtful about building out privacy and ethical protections around it. But my interest and also just my own technical background is on creating scaled solutions and then building analytics and tools on top of that. But I also, again, like I think there are people doing super important work around more um, kind of not analog, but more discrete and people powered data collection, processes.
All right, great. I think we are coming to the end of the questions. Um, I believe we have one more from Brian. I would think that API solutions would be much more robust and powerful than scraping solutions. Do you see it otherwise, or is scraping just a pragmatic short-term approach to take?
Yeah, mostly latter. It is mostly a what can we do in a moment when the platforms are taking increasingly adversarial approaches to this. They are not providing the APIs, et cetera. And the long term, I think, is if we can get the long term vision in place, I think that involves some APIs, other types of solutions. Um, but I also say it's also technically they're not always necessarily different. There are um, you can find publicly available APIs that you can use to kind of, you know, essentially de facto scrape. So oftentimes, like technically, there's gray area in between those two. But yeah, I think the short term is living in a world in which we are trying to um, not make perfect the enemy of the good.
Well, I guess I'll ask a question while um, we're waiting for any final ones to come in. Having wrapped up this paper with Naomi Schiffman, I'm wondering what you're turning your attention to next.
Um, yeah, good question. So we have another paper coming out, which is going to be looking at how commercial social listening tools actually get their data. And spoiler alert, there's a lot of scraping going on. And one also piece, another spoiler alert is a lot of the platforms seem fully aware that there's scraping happening and do not take an adversarial approach to the commercial entities that do it, while they sometimes do it to the research community. But then I'm increasingly thinking about the tooling and infrastructure side of things, which is what tooling and if scraping does make sense. And by the way, I would love if there are people on this call who disagree with my thesis, I would be super welcome to push back. Um, but if that is the case, where are the biggest needs on the tooling and infrastructure side? And let's start building them.
Great. Well, is there anything final, anything else from the report or from the paper that you'd like to kind of shout out before we wrap up?
Yeah, there's one last shout out. I'm a Knight Fellow at the George Washington Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, and one of the programs that we've been working on there with Rebecca Trumbull and also, but mostly Anna Lenhart's been leading it, is actually a tracker that is tracking all of the new programs coming online in Europe, thanks to the DSA. And it's a super interesting. If you're curious where things are right now, it's a super fascinating window that's also been like super helpful for all of my work. So I'll plug the tracker.
All right. Well, you heard it here first, everyone. Check out the tractor. And thank you so much, Brandon. We really appreciate this, really appreciate your insights and your time. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for spending this hour with us. And be sure to check out the next Spring Speaker Series events the next couple of Wednesdays. They're coming to an end. So be sure to not miss the next two. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks again, Brandon, and have a great day. All right. Bye-bye.